Watchmen has been adapted into a two-parter animated movie that is out now. The first chapter came out in August earlier this year, and the second chapter just dropped a couple of days ago. This is one that I was actually looking forward to because Watchmen is my favorite graphic novel. I don't think that's a sentence that you're going to, hear for the first time, I think, because most people will tell you that if they follow the comic book genre. It is one of those stories that has stood the test of time, and aspects of it, particularly its more important socio-political themes and aspects of society that it's dealing with, pertain even to now. And so it's remained a timeless work in that sense. And it's not the first time it's been adapted. Zack Snyder did his own adaptation in 2009, which has been given a lot more love in the time since its release, especially with the ultimate cut coming out and it adding in a few things that completed the entire story. And so going into this version of Watchmen, I was very curious at what they were going to do, and so I checked out both chapters earlier. And similar to something like Rebel Moon a couple of months ago, I'm going to do this in two halves. So I'm going to first talk about the first chapter of the movie, and then I'll talk about the second chapter. And there are going to be some spoilers over here, so if you've not seen Watchmen, these movies, or you've not read the graphic novel, I'm going to give some details away, so you've been warned. But without further ado, let's get into it. So we begin with chapter 1, which adapts the first 5 issues of the graphic novel, the first 5 chapters, if you will. We start off where the graphic novel starts, with the death of the comedian. He's already been found dead, and trying to figure out who killed him, and a conspiracy that is building up regarding killing masks, potentially getting rid of superheroes as the world seems to be on the brink of a new world war. Rorschach in the middle of all of this is someone who is chasing all of that, and he's trying to talk to former members of the Watchmen, who were a superhero team that were serving in New York at that time. But due to the Keene Act being passed in 1977, it seems like things have become outlawed for superheroes, so they can't really be out on the streets anymore. But as all of this is going on, you're getting to learn more about the team dynamic that existed before, all the issues that happened while they were superheroes, and eventually the things that led to them being outlawed. And that way I think the movie does a very good job of bringing a lot of the graphic novel to the screen pretty effectively. I've read the graphic novel a bunch of times. I know that thing pretty much panel for panel, so I can tell you for certain, this is panel for panel. They have tried to emulate it as much as possible to exactly how it plays out in the graphic novel. And I think for the most part it manages to do exactly that very nicely. It's not exactly the same. Like animation wise, for instance, it doesn't look like Dave Gibbons' art style. They've done a few things over here to make it, their own art style, which I think for the most part it works, although there are a couple of sequences that maybe could have looked a bit better. But there is some dazzling work over here and some very vibrant use of imagery. I think they did a very good job of getting most of that very well onto screen. Dialogue for dialogue too. There are some exchanges that are exactly like they are as Alan Moore wrote them. And if you watch those conversations play out, even to the pauses in panels between those moments in the graphic novel are present in here. There's this one conversation between Dan and Laurie on a rooftop as they're talking about a previous nemesis that they had to deal with, and Rorschach throwing him down an elevator shaft. And there are some pauses and laughs along those lines which are exactly like they're shown in the graphic novel. And so in that way, it is again very much following that work. The voice performances that you get out of it are very good too. I think Matthew Rhys as Dan Dryberg, or the Night Owl, I think he did a very good job. Katie Sackhoff as Silk Spectre, or Laurie Uspechik, was really, really good. I would say she's one of my favorite performances of this entire two-parter, actually. And Titus Welliver as Rorschach was really great. Rorschach is one of those characters that you have to nail if you're doing a Watchmen adaptation. You have to get it just right. And I think they did a very good job over here. Michael Cerveris as Dr. Manhattan is a very important role too. And there's an entire, of course, sequence, as you know, which is now a very iconic sequence in comic book fandom, which is his origin story, and how he tells that story while he's sitting on Mars is brilliantly captured over here. Panel for panel again, yes, and it's showcased very much the same way, but the voice work and how to sell the emotions of that scene are nailed over here. I keep saying panel for panel as in like that's an issue, which it's not, but I do think that there might be an issue for someone who might want a little more when it comes to chapter 1. Like if there are certain things you wanted to see a bit more of, then you might not get that. But one thing that I do think it makes a play for, and it does a fairly good job of, is trying to bring in even the tiny anecdotes that go with the graphic novel. Like of course you have tales of the Black Freighter being told as all of this is going down, and of course that's very important thematically to the entire story, especially with how things go down in chapter 2, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. But when it also comes to each chapter bookend, every time it ends with like this excerpt from a novel or an interview or a news clipping or an essay, and they've tried to incorporate some of that into the movie as well, as it pertains importantly to the story. Like there's a point where you do get a reading of Under the Hood from Hollis Mason, which is something that's a bit in the graphic novel as well. And so I like the fact that they tried to bring that in as much as they did as well, even though at times when you try to do something like that, it could affect the pacing, but they've used it as a bookend of their own when it comes to some of the storytelling, which I think they did a very good job with. And when it comes to realizing those characters a bit more going down that line, I also want to give a shout out to the comedian's work over here. I think Rick D. Wasserman is the voice actor, and he does a very, very good job as the comedian. This is such a sick character, and there's such a demented nature to him that is captured again really, really well, and major props to that. I'm not talking too much about Adrian Veidt over here, Ozymandias, because he really comes into play in the second half of the story, and we'll talk more about that very, very soon in like a few seconds, just a few more seconds. But overall, I was satisfied with how chapter 1 did a good job of getting those first 5 issues in there. It ends with Rorschach getting arrested at the end of chapter 5, which is similar to the graphic novel where he's framed for killing Moloch. And so that's once again in here. And overall, I think they did a good job with chapter 1. Chapters 6 to 12. Rorschach is in jail. Dan and Laurie are together now. Dr. Manhattan has escaped to Mars. He's been accused of also giving cancer to a bunch of people that have been close to him. And it seems like all signs are pointing to the return of the Watchmen, even as the world is very much on the brink now. The doomsday clock is moving up to like almost 2 minutes to midnight. And it seems like everything is about to go to hell. And so chapter 2 has to deal with what's coming and the fallout of that. And so that is a very important aspect of the story, because essentially everything comes around over here when it comes to setting up the themes and when it comes to the entire point of the story. Here's where it all plays out, and it's the toughest part of the adaptation, I would say. But I have to give credit, they nailed it. I think this is very well done. I think chapter 1 was good. I think chapter 2 is really great, and I think a lot of that has to do once again with how they've structured it. This is a few minutes longer than chapter 1. The first chapter is about an hour and 23 minutes. This is an hour and 29 minutes, so there's a few more things over there. There's a few sequences over here which they've altered a little bit and expanded upon to give a little more backing to certain characters and to certain situations. There's a couple of conversations that have been altered as well, like for example, as Dan is looking into shell companies that could be involved in all of this when it comes to the murders of Comedian and Moloch, and the idea of going after Adrian, an assassin goes after him. All of this might be connected to this one major company that could be holding it all, but he doesn't know what it is. That conversation in the graphic novel he has with Laurie. In the movie, it's with Hollis Mason. When it came to Rorschach's psychiatric evaluations, I think that's one of those parts of the graphic novel that they needed to nail. They did. They were also a little careful though, because I think somewhere along the way, even they realized some stuff is just too disturbing. Like, these are already rated R movies, but some stuff is a little too extreme, I guess, even for them. Like, for example, in the graphic novel, when Rorschach is tracking the murderer of that 6-year-old girl, he comes across these 2 dogs, German Shepherds, that he owns. And eventually he kills the dogs, he throws them through the windows, and then he ties up the man below and sets the place on fire, kills him. In the movie version, you don't get the dogs being thrown through the window. That seemed like a bit much for even, for the animators. So they're like, we're not doing that. But he does kill the dogs. Like, you do see a little tiny sliver of that. And yes, the man does get set on fire and then he gets killed. And so they do some of that in here, and the very disturbing nature of that is captured quite well. Now, speaking of the characters, I mentioned Ozymandias is not really in chapter 1, and so here we get to chapter 2. Troy Baker, I think, does a great job. He plays the role very subtly, as you expect him to, because Adrian is cold right now. Everything that's happening when it comes to saving the world, and his idea of doing that with, creating a ruse of an extraterrestrial attack in New York that would stop warring countries against each other and focus all its issues on doing something bigger. Deranged plan, but the way that is brought together, tying in Tales of the Black Freighter as well, is very good. Because the thematic aspect of Tales of the Black Freighter, when it comes to Watchmen's story overall, is very important. Like, you need that to cohesively come together so that it all makes sense. And as you're following the Black Freighter storyline, especially with this character who's trying to take on the monsters, not realizing he is becoming a monster himself, that tying into Ozymandias' entire journey of seeing a world being torn apart and, wanting to save it, built on this wreckage, but realizing that he is then accepted as one of his own. There is, again, a very disturbing sense to that, a very pessimistic sense to it, something that leaves a sour taste in your mouth. But then Watchmen was never a happy story. And eventually when the attack goes down, I think once again the brutality of that, as that squid teleports into New York and causes the amount of destruction it does with that sound it emits, I think it's very well executed. I would say that's expanded, in fact, from the graphic novel. They did a couple of things over there which I think were very, very effective to that fact. Laurie and John's conversation on Mars is also really well done, leading to that revelation of who Laurie's actual father is, that being the comedian. And I think they did a very good job of making that emotional moment land as well. In fact, everything that came to Laurie and John, I would say, was excellent. I think these characters were given a lot of love, and bringing all of that from the material to the movie, they did a great job with it, and they nailed the landing as well, especially when it came to the idea that now everything's fine, especially as Adrian is like, I got to, play this out to the end, and it all worked out, and Dr. Manhattan is just like, Adrian, nothing ever ends, and he just leaves. And it's like that there is that sadness to that fact of an inevitability that is to come, which could go on. And that's something that you get hints of, not just hints, you get a full follow-up to that with the HBO series that was a few years ago that was a sequel series, which I also really like, by the way. I reviewed that on my channel. You should go check that out. I was a huge fan of that limited series, and it was a worthy successor in my opinion. And so overall, at the end of the day, when it came to chapters 1 and 2 of Watchmen, I think they did a very solid job of bringing it all to screen, and I am very impressed with the final result of it. It's not 100% perfect. There's a couple of gripes I have here and there, especially when it comes to trying to adapt everything and try to make it as cohesive as possible. Like, I was impressed with how much they were trying to do, but some things, a couple of things got lost to the wayside. The animation, for the most part, is really good, although there's a couple of things which I think don't feel as strongly done as the other sequences. Like, there's an opening moment in chapter 2 that I thought, that's not as good as some of the other stuff I've seen so far. But overall, I was very satisfied with it. And I think they did a very good job with it, and I do recommend checking it out if you're a big fan of Watchmen as a whole. I think they're doing some impressive work over here, and it's a very good transition to screen. Like I said, it doesn't always try to do some new stuff. Like, if you've read the graphic novel, it is very much beat for beat, but it's good beat for beat that doesn't lose the thematic nature of certain things. In terms of grades, I would give chapter 1 an 8 out of 10. I would give chapter 2 a 9 out of 10, which averages out at about an 8.5 out of 10. I'm also going to talk about the Zack Snyder movie later, because I do want to do a video on that, and I have a lot to say about it, and I look forward to talking to you guys about that soon. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Look forward to more videos in the very near future. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe, and I will see you guys at the movies.